It was a beautiful sight, Revan decided, as she watched the majority of the migrant fleet slowly drift past a gas giant. Little probes occasionally shot down towards the planet or back towards the fleet, busy harvesting the He-3 needed for the bigger ship's reactors. It was calming. Especially since the Quarians had the process refined to an art form. A coordinated dance of vessels all buzzing around to keep the fleet as a whole supplied in the shortest time possible. She couldn't watch much longer though, there were still several things she needed to do today. Such as dealing with the meeting that was about to start. Several holobanks lit up right on time and the forms of the Quarian admirals flickered into view. Revan was briefly reminded of the disappointing meeting with the Citadel Council and her brief lesson on politics with Shepard and Anderson. Though that was mostly just because they were all using holotanks and not because there was a deliberate snub on any of their parts. Unlike what happened at the Human Counselor's office, there was simply too much to do to justify all of them traveling to one ship just for a face-to-face meeting. There were hundreds of ships to coordinate, updates and ready reports from various sub-leaders to shift through, and dozens of other tasks to deal with. It wasn't every day that two previously warring species prepared to combine into one entity after all. So Revan could forgive the admirals wanting to make sure everything about today went as smoothly as possible rather than play political games. She actually respected them for it. Especially since her ego wasn't so fragile, she needed the constant assurances to how great she was for allowing this to happen, or some such like Malak had degenerated to after his betrayal. "Are we ready to begin then?" the Empress questioned once the connection between them all stabilized. Mostly rhetorical at this point. Too many things were already in motion to simply stop now. "The heavy fleet is standing by. We're ready for FDR as soon as we get the word." Hangarel confirmed. "We sent a message to all vessels to cease resupply efforts and return to their ships," Ziokoris said. "Once that is complete, the civilian fleet will be ready as well. Special projects are secured and waiting on our escorts to arrive." Darkson added, still upset at being forced to acknowledge the Geth would not be subordinated to the Quarians again and would be operating as equals. Which, oddly enough, made her group the hardest to control. Revan had thought the heavy fleet full of Quarians itching for a fight would be the ones she needed to keep an eye on. Instead it was the scientists who just couldn't seem to understand no really meant no when it came to trying to enslave the Geth. "Good, then we are just waiting for the Geth fleet to link up with ours. Admiral Raan, what's the timeline look like?" "Forward elements of the scout fleet are on their way back after confirming the escort fleet. We should link up with them within an hour and then we will be ready to make the jump to Rannoch," Shaylaran reported. Revan nodded. Everything was on schedule then. Something of a novelty when it came to fleets with the numbers they were dealing with, but once again, the Quarians had honed this aspect of space travel to a fine art. "Excellent, then shall we end this now? I'm sure there are still matters that each of you need to address before we go to Hyper to FTR. She corrected herself. "Actually, Revan, we had some concerns we wanted to raise and figured this would be the best time." Shaylaran spoke up. Revan's hand paused over the disconnect button, but she had no issue turning to meet the Admiral's own visor. "Concerns, Admiral?" "Yes, specifically about the orders to abandon some of our older ships," Raan clarified. "It's not that we don't understand the desire to phase out the more damaged ships, especially since we would be able to relocate the crews to Rannoch and not overstrain the support systems of other ships, but..." She trailed off, apparently having trouble coming up with how to phrase the next part. "But we don't trust you," Hangarel stated bluntly after it was clear Shaylaran wasn't going to find a polite way to say things. "You or your Geth. And without those ships we won't be able to evacuate everyone if this is some elaborate trap. We would be forced to leave some behind for you to do who knows what with." "Ahem, not that we are expecting some sort of treachery at this point." Ziokoris jumped in a pacifying voice. It actually amused Revan how quick the Admiral spoke up to shield his companion from any anger his blunt statement could have generated. But we need to keep the safety of the fleet in mind, and several of the ships you have listed for priority dismantling are too important to simply abandon for little reason. I understand your hesitation, Admirals. But the reality is that that isn't your call to make anymore. Revan reminded them. And we all have too much to do to repeat this dance of you all saying you cannot trust me and me telling you to do so anyway. We are aware, which is why we wanted this cleared up now rather than let suspicions fester. Shaylaran played peacekeeper once again. Very well, what questions did you have specifically? Why the sudden demand to have these ships decommissioned? Hangarol demanded. Even with the space on Rannoch to live, there is no reason to phase this many ships all at once. Simple enough. We need the metal to finish building the fleet that will replace them. Revan replied. The Geth were able to supply nearly all of the material needed for the frames and armor without issue, but the interior plating is harder to come by since the Geth do not require compartments to be airtight in their own designs. New ships? Darkson quirked her head. I wasn't aware that we would be commissioning new vessels, though I suppose with the Geth's infrastructure it would be hard to accomplish. I don't see why this is so important then. Yes, some ships in the fleet are less functional than we would like, but anything you replace them with will not be too much of an overall improvement based on designs available for purchase. The scientist paused. Unless you are converting Geth designs to be usable for an organic crew, I suppose. In which case I would be happy to lend my expertise in correcting any flaws. We aren't using Geth designs. Revan cut her off. Modifying those for efficient organic use would take years. The Geth and Quarians, once the initial settlement efforts are completed, will be working to build the designs that I have provided. As for why you haven't heard about this, I believe we had a meeting scheduled 2 days from now to discuss shipbuilding. It would have been covered there, but the files are already available for you to look at. Darkson immediately pulled up her Omnitool and presumably began digging through the files Revan had shared. The others glanced at the files but after a moment dismissed them to look over later. That is another thing we were hoping you would clear up, Zyorkoris said hesitantly. All these designs, they are completely different from anything I've ever seen. You talked about technology being given to the Geth, the same Geth who are more advanced than most races in the galaxy. Which really begs the question, who are you? Who are your backers? Because this is beyond you being the face of some splinter group. Revan had wondered when they would get around to asking something like that, though she was a little disappointed it hadn't happened after they arrived at Rannoch. It would have made for fewer distractions. I don't mind answering, but is there a particular reason you feel this can't wait? Is it unreasonable for us to be curious about our new leader? Shaylaran said innocently, though she didn't fool Revan for an instant. It seemed the admirals had picked up her distaste for most of the using Tully Zora's trial as a means to advance various plots and upending Revan's plan at the same time, and were using Shaylaran as a mouthpiece since Revan had a better impression of her overall. I suppose not. What do you want to know? Where do you come from? We know you aren't human or Asari. Very well, this is a bit of a long story, but I'll suppose you deserve to hear it. In a galaxy far, far away there is a planet named Dantooine. Oh. We might have an issue, Councillor Valerne said as the rest of the councillors settled into the meeting room. Another vague rumor about our favorite empress that deserves our full attention despite doing nothing countless other leaders are doing and hundreds of more pressing matters to discuss? Anderson sniped but went largely ignored. All of them knew he was due to be replaced in a few weeks, and most of them were not even bothering to pretend to respect each other at this point. Councillors, please, let's at least try to keep things civil. Tavos pleaded. Valerne, what issue do you have to bring up? As it so happens, it does have to do with Revan. Spartacus groaned. What, did she manage to convince the Batarians to join her empire? Are we going to have to seriously consider war with the Terminus systems now? Thankfully not, but we may have to consider a war between them and the Asari Republic instead. They would be mostly justified as well. The other 3 counselors perked up at the unexpected news. "Excuse me?" Tavos practically shrieked in an uncharacteristic break in composure. What goddess-damned reason could the Republic have for trying to start a war? The attempted assassination of their head of state by a Justicar and a team of huntresses. Valerne replied, pulling up a file from his Omnitool. The council watched several camera feeds cut together that showed the masked form of the Sith Empress walking down a city street before she was ambushed. From there it showed her pursuing her attackers, snippets of various traps being set off from security cameras, and a significant amount of collateral damage being done before the Sith headed towards a park area and confronted the Justicar and her team. The quality was abysmal, but clear enough to show the Justicar's side was the same that had initiated the hostilities. It also showed them getting annihilated by a single combatant. This is just some of what the STG teams in the area managed to piece together. Valerne continued. More instances are being uploaded to the extranet every hour as more people go digging for details. Unfortunately, the only footage we've retrieved of the main fight has been incidental background shots from cameras that just happen to be pointed in the right direction. Anything directly pointed at the park has been blocked or disabled, but they were able to determine all of the Justicar's team was killed except for possibly one. Which may be a blessing in disguise for us. Spiratus leaned forward on his podium. This is on Ilium, correct? Why is this even being broadcast? The governor should have put a lid on everything until we could work out a response. The initial broadcast was made from the governor's office. Valerne said helplessly. Tavos seemed to snap back to attention. What possessed her to do that? Anything involving the death of a Justicar, especially one involving a major public figure, should have been fully investigated before any action was taken. It seems she was using this incident to distract from a major gunfight that was ravaging other parts of the city. A full conflict between Jane Shepard and her crew, Liara Tsoni, and the Shadow Broker's forces. We've also held back Revan's status from the public until we had more information and could avoid causing another Geth panic. Governor Rouse didn't know who she was attempting to use as a distraction. Damn, if a Spectre was implicated in causing the death of a Justicar, that could have kicked off its own war. Is there a chance we can wash our hands of this by disavowing Shepard as a Spectre? Now hold on a minute. Anderson objected explosively at the Turian counselor. I have yet to see any evidence Shepard was even involved with this other Justicar. I won't let her take the fall for us just because it would be convenient. It wouldn't work anyway. Tavos sighed as she cradled her head. Revan wasn't seen leaving with the Normandy, so it would be easy to say there was no affiliation. It also doesn't help that there was another Spectre involved with this mess, so if that ever comes to light we will lose all credibility. Valerne nodded. Yes, Spectre Vossier. She submitted a report about being involved in some capacity. Thankfully she was not captured on recording just yet, but we can't risk it coming out later. Disavowing Shepard without solid proof is not possible either. I think the obvious thing to do is figure out why an Asari Justicar decided to launch a full assassination attempt on what should be to the wider galaxy a completely random person. Anderson said drolly. Rather than just trying to figure out how to blame someone else for our problems. The other 3 counselors exchanged glances but ultimately agreed. The clock on controlling the narrative of what happened in Nos Astra was ticking. And if they wanted to be the ones to come out ahead, they needed a more complete picture on what happened. Especially if they wanted to avoid the newest warlord in the galaxy using this as leverage to make demands of her own. I have the updates on the fleet construction you asked for, Empress Revan. Risa Hura announced as she entered the office, crossing the room and handing the Sith a datapad. Good, any surprises I should know about? It's in the summary, but several engine components are going to be delayed due to manufacturing errors that were discovered. It turns out that the Waldos the Geth used for their own ships were just barely within tolerance. But trying to run them continuously like that weakened some of the structures, made some of those tolerances slip, and it wasn't caught until later in the QA process. We're going to have to scrap most of the parts we already made, rebuild the Waldos properly, and remake the necessary parts. Revan sighed inaudibly. That was a delay they didn't need, but there wasn't much she could do about it now. How is that affecting the fleet? Luckily we caught the faulty parts before they were installed on much, but most of the escort classes are going to be missing engines until the issue is fixed. By the end of the week we will only have 5 Harrowers fully operational, 10 Centurions, and 30 Terminus-class destroyers. Not to mention we are still bleeding operational warships as we decommission and break them for materials. Admiral Hangerel in particular was concerned about how many ships we have going to the breakers and how few replacements we have. Remind him that the new ships we are building are worth any 3 of a similar class he already has. That should calm him down. Yes, but I think his concern is more about the displaced crews. Risa offered. A lot of them are going a little stir-crazy being locked planetside. The appeal of the homeworld is already wearing off, No, not at all. Revan merely glanced at her secretary. One of the benefits to dealing with a race that used full bodysuits was that she barely needed to use the Force to convey her disbelief in that statement. Her body language was plenty. Okay, maybe a little. It's not that we are ungrateful, but several of our more active members have grown, Ward. And thanks to the Geth automating most of the work planetside, there isn't much they can do to distract themselves. Revan nodded and made a note to see what could be done there without compromising their timeline more than it already was before checking a holo for the time. She still had a few minutes to spare, but if possible she wanted to wrap this up. Is there anything else I should know about? No, Empress. Everything else is in the report. Other than that, your ship is ready to leave for Omega once you're on board. Then let's not keep them waiting. Oh. Very little had changed on Omega as far as Revan was concerned since the last time she was here. It was still a hive of scum and villainy barely kept from total violence out of fear of messing with the Queen of Omega's operations. And those that ignored that fact were quick to either find themselves with some rather ruinous debts or simply disappeared, if they were lucky. It was also the kind of place she would rather not make many investments in because if Arya was ever deposed, the resulting chaos would almost certainly see those investments ruined or stolen. Unfortunately, the asteroid station was also the largest supplier of Element Zero in the Terminus systems and her empire needed that. EZO was simply too integrated into most modern designs and without a stable supply, a great amount of her already stressed industrial base would simply shut down. And while Revan knew she could eventually replace some of that dependency with technology from her home galaxy, that would be a labor taking years to complete at minimum and be fairly worthless if the logistics to feed those technologies wasn't in place. Which wasn't to say she hadn't already tasked the Geth with gathering certain materials when possible. The Sith sighed and refocused on her meditation. Arya was already late for their meeting and Revan knew it was deliberate. Unlike Shepard, who despite her fame, was a mere soldier and commander of a single ship, Revan was something of a peer. Which naturally meant she couldn't just walk on up to the ruler of Omega. No, that would be far too easy. Instead Arya needed to put on a show of making Revan wait. And Revan was inclined to let her. After all she lost was a bit of time to let Arya approach their meeting when she felt comfortable. But after another 15 minutes and no sign of Arya asking her to join her for an audience, Revan is forced to assume they've skipped past the pleasantries and moved straight to the part where Arya tries to see exactly how far Revan would allow herself to be pushed around. 45 minutes should be enough to show respect but not deference. And if it wasn't, well, Revan wasn't exactly desperate for Arya's help specifically. The Sith smoothly rose from her meditative position and made her way out to the dance floor of Afterlife and then made a direct line for the observation booth Arya used as her throne room. A Batarian guard attempted to get in her way, but a wave of her hand had him pinned helplessly against the wall as she walked up the stairs and into Arya's space. "I didn't invite you up here. If you know what's good for you, I'd leave before I decide to learn who you are." Revan had to give the Asari one thing. She certainly had the aloof and disinterested act down pat. She also didn't believe for a second that Arya hadn't been watching her the entire time. "Let's move past the games, shall we? You may enjoy them, but my time is more valuable than that." That's not the attitude of someone coming to ask for a favor. Revan. The Asari pirate queen dropped the pretense of not knowing her guest. "Because I'm not asking for a favor," the Sith Empress replied. "This is simply a business transaction." "You say that, but what you're asking goes beyond just business. 60% of Omega's EZO export? Even if you can afford it, that's going to upset people. Especially the nosy ones out in Citadel space that think they have a say in what goes on here. I don't know if you're worth the effort." "I would think that would be a decision for Omega's mining companies to determine." Arya's smile was a vicious little thing. "Maybe Shepard didn't tell you before she ran off to blow up an entire star system. Omega doesn't have a titled ruler because it doesn't need one, and there is only one rule to follow. Don't fuck with Arya. The reason for that is simple. I am Omega. So, convince me why I should put up with some old ladies whining for some backwater warlord." Revan didn't bristle at the frankly mild insult. Instead, she leaned forward and prepared herself for a probably very annoying conversation where the both of them tried to wring everything possible out of the other without giving up too much. "I'm sure I can give you some incentives." In the end, they didn't come to an agreement. At least not a long-term one. Arya eventually sold Revan a good amount of EZO that would satisfy her needs for a few months, but had absolutely refused to commit to anything like a long-term contract. Which was especially frustrating for the Sith because she did not have the time to come and personally negotiate a sale every time her empire needed to buy EZO. Maybe next time she came, it would be on one of the almost completed Harrowers. She always found stubborn leaders much more flexible when a dreadnought was nearby. Even Omega's large collection of mercenary ships would be cautious of picking a fight with an Imperial battle group. Especially if they didn't have a unified command structure. Revan brushed those thoughts away and stood to leave, but paused when Arya had one more thing to say. "Before you go, you should know there has been a group of Asari poking around looking for you. Weird religious types. Normally I wouldn't say anything, but they've been annoying me. Thought you would like to know." Religious Asari looking for Revan specifically. It didn't take a leap in logic to guess they were connected to the knockoff Jedi Order she had encountered on Ilium. "I see. Thank you for the information." Arya smirked. "It's no trouble. Either you take care of them for me or they take care of you. No matter what, they won't be my problem any longer." Oh. Despite her desire to know more about a Force sect that had somehow managed to make its way to this galaxy, Revan had no intention of searching them out just because Arya had dangled some information in front of her nose. In fact, she had been fully intent on just leaving Omega immediately to return to Rannoch. Yes, she would need to deal with the Pious D and whatever issue they had with her eventually, but that could wait. There were simply too many bigger plans in motion to dedicate time to hunting down a single Force sect. Not with an entire fleet modernize and update, several planets to fortify, and a war with the Batarians to plan. Because time was ticking down until the Reapers arrived. And the galaxy was not ready. It had been a bitter relief when Shepard had sent her a message about what had happened at the Alpha Relay. The Reapers had indoctrinated an entire research team tasked with looking at different artifacts from both the Sovereign incident as well as a few others discovered elsewhere, and had used them to reconfigure the Mass Effect relay to retrieve them from dark space in a similar way the Citadel was supposed to be used. Revan didn't know the full story. Shepard's message was woefully brief besides the facts, but it had resulted in the commander crashing an asteroid into the relay which, weakened by the slapdash modifications made by the indoctrinated scientists, went critical and destroyed the system along with a Batarian colony of about 300,000 citizens. Shepard finished the message saying that she was heading back to Alliance space to surrender for trial regarding the incident. A move Revan understood given Shepard's personality but couldn't help but be frustrated with on a strategic scale. The Reapers had just shown they could still use the relay network to return at any point and were only stopped by what was essentially a large amount of luck. And Revan's biggest ally in driving the need to prepare for the Reapers outside her own power base had just been taken off the board. And there was nothing stopping the Reapers from making the same modifications to another relay somewhere anyone not indoctrinated would notice. So yes, Revan considered anything not an immediate threat as something that would have to wait until her fleet was ready at the least. And why she was incredibly annoyed when a man in a Cerberus uniform stepped out of a corridor and prevented her from getting back to her ship. "Excuse me, Miss Revan, but the elusive man has a message for you." "I'm not interested." She quickly refused, trying to sidestep the man only for him to move to continue blocking her path. "Oh, but I insist." The man continued as several more humans in rather bulky armor suddenly surrounded them, guns trained on the Sith. "It would be in your best interest." Revan looked at the armed soldiers and then back to the man. There was a slight current of warning in the Force, she best not underestimate them. "Fine, you have my attention,"